Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our February installment of Tuesday Talks. My name is Caroline Imparato, and I am the Assistant Director here at the Atwood Museum. We are very excited for our lecture tonight. Before we jump into that, I'm going to start with a few housekeeping items. The first is a happy reminder that we are celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. We have lots of exciting things planned to honor the centennial celebration, including 2 new exhibits, the unveiling of our new Media and Education Center, a historic house tour, a new documentary on the prolific local artist Alice Stalnick, and much more. Please feel free to sign up for our newsletter to keep up with all of our event updates. Next on the list is that our membership letters were mailed this week. So keep an eye out for those in your mailboxes, and we appreciate you considering renewing your memberships for 2023. Your support means everything to us. Now, looking ahead to our March lecture, it will be on growing resilience, tapping into your garden's enormous potential, and our guest speaker will be Allison Houghton. This will be on March 7th at 5 p.m., also via Zoom. And finally, we will have a few minutes for questions at the conclusion of our lecture. So if you think of any questions during the lecture, feel free to type them into the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, and we'll read them out at the end. So now I get to introduce you all to tonight's speaker. He's a pretty busy person, so we appreciate him taking the time to present this lecture to our community here at the museum. And without further ado, tonight's lecturer will be Senior Chief Ross Comstock, and he is a 2000 graduate of Sallisaw High School in Sallisaw, Oklahoma. This is where he first enlisted in the Navy in September of 2000 and served as an aviation electronics technician aboard the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. He then enlisted in the Coast Guard in February of 2005. He assumed command of Coast Guard Station Chatham in May of 2022. His previous assignments include Executive Petty Officer of Station Portsmouth, Virginia, United States Coast Guard Cutter Decisive, United States Coast Guard Station Chincoteague, Virginia, United States Coast Guard Station Port Aransas, Texas, United States Coast Guard Cutter Brant, and the United States Coast Guard Station, Oregon Inlet in North Carolina. BMCS Comstock's awards include the Coast Guard Commendation Medal, 4 Coast Guard Achievement Medals, and 4 Coast Guard Team Commendation Medals, in addition to other personal and service awards. He has earned the Permanent Cutterman Insignia, the Advanced Boat Forces Operations Insignia, and the Officer in Charge of Float and Ashore competencies. A graduate of Class 236 of the Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer Academy, he has attended various service-related and leadership courses and holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Emergency Management from Ashford University. Without further ado, please join us in welcoming Senior Chief Ross Comstock.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Caroline, for the very kind introduction. It is quite the honor to be asked to speak to you tonight on a subject that's very near and dear to me. I've always been kind of a history nut, and as Caroline mentioned, I've been to a lot of units within the Coast Guard that have a lot of history to them. So new to Chatham, had a lot to learn about the history of the Coast Guard here, and was quite surprised, actually. I had always been under the impression that the Coast Guard's beginnings were rooted in places like the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the shores of New Jersey. And in my short time here, I've learned that most of our humble beginnings came from Massachusetts. So a couple of the assignments that Caroline mentioned had a lot of Coast Guard history as well. Surprisingly, even Port Aransas, Texas, that was the first life-saving station in that state. So even today, even after all the hurricane damage that we've had down there, you can still see the rail from the original lifeboat launch system. So after 23 years of service, been fortunate to be stationed to a lot of these stations that have so much history to them. Let's touch on Oregon Inlet for a second. Something very interesting about Oregon Inlet is it's still the active Coast Guard station that is closest to the old Pea Island station. It was crewed by Surfman Richard Etheridge and his all African-American crew. And given that February is Black History Month, I think it's fitting to take a moment to mention that Richard Etheridge was the first Black keeper of the Lifesaving Service. And for a time, his crew was all African-American. They were awarded the Gold Life-Saving Medal for the rescue of all souls on board the schooner E.S. Newman in 1896. The Gold Life-Saving Medal is the highest award Congress can confer to the saving of life outside of combat, and was also awarded to the crew of the 36-500, as you may remember, in the rescue of the SS Pendleton. Today, Richard Etheridge's gravesite is on the grounds of the North Carolina State Aquarium in Manteo, North Carolina, and his legacy lives on through the fast response cutter that was named in his honor. In December of 2021, I learned I'd be taking command of our reasonably famous lifeboat station here in Chatham. Obviously, Chatham is well known for the improbable rescue of the Pendleton, but there is much more to the unit than the heroism of Bernie Weber and his crew. In fact, in my first week at the station, I mentioned to my predecessor that I felt we were doing ourselves a bit of a disservice by focusing so much on that rescue and effectively overlooking the missions that have been conducted each and every day over 200 years of service. So tonight, I'd like to give a brief history of the little-known birth of what is today known as the Coast Guard. And it all happened right here in Massachusetts. And interestingly enough, like all good ideas in American history, the story of the Coast Guard begins in a tavern in Boston. In 1785, a group of concerned citizens met at the famed Bunch of Grapes Tavern on State Street to consider formation of a sort of humane society, similar to the likes of the British Royal Humane Society. Their goal was to reduce the number of needless deaths resulting from shipwrecks on the desolate shores of much of the coast. You see, the problem was survivors of the shipwrecks along our treacherous coast could oftentimes make it to shore, but there was little, if any, shelter and likely no inhabitants for miles to come to their aid. So the newly formed Humane Society set out to establish huts, sort of an aid and survival station, 18 of which were strategically placed along the coast about every 5 to 7 miles, with the first one being at Scituate Beach in Cohasset. Within these huts were the basics for survival, firewood and basic provisions to sustain them until the local townspeople could reach them. Sadly, though, at first, because these huts were unattended, they were susceptible to vandalism, theft, and provisions were ransacked or they were eaten up by the rats. Responsible locals were asked to watch over these huts, but sometimes mariners arrived to find the charity house gutted of all supplies. In 1803, the Society began investigating the possibility of using lifeboats, that more souls could potentially be saved if they could utilize these boats to reach the foundered vessels. William Raymond of Nantucket was commissioned to build a lifeboat, and he delivered in 1807. This was the first lifeboat ever constructed in America, and it was placed into service at the Cohasset Station. This first boat was essentially a 30-foot whaleboat crewed by 10 men with oars. With this addition, the aid station at Cohasset became the first lifeboat station. The Massachusetts Humane Society continued to expand, and by 1872, the system grew to comprise 76 lifeboat stations, plus 8 of the old beach huts. Up to this point, the Humane Society operated no differently than your typical volunteer fire department. The boats were maintained and operated by volunteers, with funding raised and provided sporadically by the state of Massachusetts and occasionally the federal government. However, given that the men were all volunteers, response could be inadequate and unpredictable. The society was a leader in life-saving boat operations, and with the invention of the Hunt gun, which later was changed over to the Lyle gun with different advances in technology, the Hunt gun was in Weymouth. Methods were developed to shoot these lines to shipwrecks. The lifeboat houses gradually took the place of all the remaining huts until eventually the last standing hut at Tom Nevers Hill on Nantucket was finally dismantled. Despite the success of the Humane Society, their work was confined to only Massachusetts. So a physician by the name of William A. Newell worked to get the federal government formally involved with the funding of safety of life at sea with the passage of the Newell Act. William Newell, like many life-saving advocates, had once been witness to a disastrous shipwreck. He was shocked at the nation's overall lack of readiness outside of Massachusetts. With the Newell Act, $10,000 was provided, quote, for surf boats, rockets, carronades, we know them as mortars now, and other necessary apparatus for the better preservation of life and property from shipwrecks on the coast of New Jersey, unquote. Between 1848 and 1854, more of these stations were built and loosely managed, administered by the U.S. Revenue Marine. Shortly after the passage of the Newell Act in January of 1850, the benefit of a properly funded and trained service was demonstrated with the rescue of the Ayrshire. A station located in New Jersey is credited with the rescue of 201 people utilizing the life car, including several children. Conversely, during the same storm that winter, the vessel Elizabeth foundered on Long Island, where there were not yet any life-saving stations, and tragically 10 people lost their lives, including the then famous scholar and author Margaret Fuller. Now, her loss impassioned folks like Ralph Waldo Emerson to raise their voices in calling for more and better life-saving services. Meanwhile, as stations were established along the coast, it became apparent that an all-volunteer service was largely inadequate. Stations fell into disrepair through neglect and even vandalism. In some cases, the boats were taken for personal use, repairs neglected, and supplies were stolen. Despite the successes and praises heaped upon the volunteers, the results were beginning to turn disastrous. There were no paid crews, little to no training, no regulations to guide or any set of standards established. No reports or records were mandated, which resulted in an overall lack of accountability and a lack of knowledge as to what the stations were accomplishing. This general lack of organization finally came to a head in 1871. After a very tough winter, there were a number of well-publicized fatal shipwrecks along the coast. These disasters yet again enraged the public, so Congress did what Congress does, and they threw more money at the problem. In April of 1871, $200,000 was appropriated for the employment of full-time paid crews to build new stations where needed. 9 of these stations were built right here on Cape Cod: Race Point, Highlands, Peaked Hill Bars, Pamet, Cahoon's Hollow, Nauset, Orleans, Chatham, and Monomoy Point. Shortly thereafter, Sumner Kimball was appointed chief of the Revenue Marine Division. His first act as the new chief was to dispatch Captain John Faunce on an inspection tour of the stations. Notably, Captain Faunce reported that, quote, apparatus was rusty for want of care and some of it ruined, unquote. A standard was developed of 6-man crews for each station and was established, and Kimball drew up regulations with standards of performance for these crews. He categorized the stations into 3 groups: life-saving, lifeboat, and houses of refuge. Life-saving stations were manned by full-time crews during the period when wrecks were most likely. On the East Coast, this was typically April to November, which is not very different from today in what we consider these months SAR season. By 1900, these stations would be manned year-round. Thus was the creation of the U.S. Lifesaving Service, with a total of about 280 stations established to date. The new standards were immediately effective. The best measure of success was the astounding 87% reduction in shipwreck deaths in areas that were served by the U.S. Lifesaving Service. Sumner Kimball served as the only superintendent of the Lifesaving Service, as he served from the day he was nominated in 1878 to the day the Lifesaving Service was absorbed into the modern-day Coast Guard in 1915. More on that later. Today, Sumner Kimball's legacy is still felt throughout the Coast Guard, with our periodic standardization assessment teams who tour the nation conducting inspections and drills of our small boat stations. Up until 2015, the Kimball Award was the highest honor a crew could achieve from these inspections. Now, some development that happened throughout the Coast Guard is they sadly got rid of the Kimball Award because too much of the focus was on the award itself rather than how we're doing our jobs. And full disclosure, Station Chatham is up for our inspection this year. So that's coming in July, right after July 4th week. So yeah, you'll be looking for us doing a bunch of drills here real soon. While not technically a station on the Cape, it would be a great disservice to the history of the Lifesaving Service to not take a few moments to talk about Joshua James. He was the keeper of the Point Allerton Station, and prior to that, the Boston Station under the Humane Society. He is held in very high regard in the Coast Guard as the record holder for the most lives saved. Many pages have been written about his heroic service to seamen, and I'll try to work his justice in a very short summary here. As keeper of the Mass Humane Society Station at Boston during the hurricane of November 25th, 1888, he observed several vessels beginning to drag anchor in the winds of the approaching storm. He called together all volunteers for his station and made their boats and gear ready. No sooner had they completed preparations, the schooner Coxswain Green foundered nearby. After rescuing the entire crew via a breeches buoy, the schooner Gertrude Abbott struck rocks about 1,000 yards east as darkness approached. The crew had planned to wait for low tide. Under the threat of what they expected to be certain death, the entire crew volunteered to go. Now, let me expand on that for a second. The storm was so bad, and the situation for the Gertrude Abbott was so perilous that Joshua James told them, "You may not make it back. In fact, you probably won't make it back from this mission alive. Do I have any volunteers?" Literally, the entire station stepped forward to go partake in this rescue. I'm not doing it full justice here. I'm giving you a very short summary of what happened that evening. I highly encourage you, if you have any interest in this, to take a look at Joshua James and these two hurricanes that I'm mentioning, because it is an absolutely tremendous story. So the whole crew volunteered to go. They launched a surf boat under tremendous conditions and returned with everyone safe. That is, the entire crew returned, and they were able to rescue everyone on board. Then at about 3 a.m. on that same night, the schooner Bertha F. Walker wrecked just offshore, and her crew was clinging to the rigging. The surfmen drugged their second surf boat, the first one being destroyed by the previous rescue. They drugged the second surf boat 4 miles over the beach to launch, and all crew were saved from that wreck as well. Then, just as the crew was returning, Keeper James learned of the schooner H.C. Higginson foundered on the rocks and again launched the surf boat. That boat became damaged, and the crew returned to the beach, patched the holes, and set out again, and they rescued the 5 remaining survivors. As the crew headed for home again, yet another wreck was found. This is all in the same night, in the same about 18-hour period. This was the brigantine Alice. James and his crew saved 2 salvors who had attempted to save that vessel's cargo. All told, in one night, James and his crew rescued 29 people from 6 different wrecks. Later, he was appointed keeper of the newly designated U.S. Lifesaving Station at Point Allerton and led that crew to a number of herring rescues during the hurricane of 1889. That was the next year. I could go on for much longer than my allotted time, just recounting his leadership and examples set forth for all of us in command of lifeboat stations today. I'll leave you with this little piece of trivia, and we ask this for fun sometimes. On March 19th, 1902, Captain James was 74 years old, and he was still serving as the keeper of Station Port Allerton. They were returning to the station after a surf boat drill. As they beached the boat, Joshua James looked out on the water, observing, "The tide is ebbing." He then stepped from the boat and, quote, "fell dead at his post of duty," unquote. He was buried a short distance away up the hill from the site where Station Port Allerton is still located today, a most fitting death for such a dedicated lifesaver, in my opinion. With that, I'd like to take a second to go on a tangent. We're going to talk about the often repeated unofficial motto of the Lifesaving Service. And I still hear it today quite often among our small boat units. That is, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. If I remember correctly, something similar to this was uttered in the finest hours, but allegedly, the story, Keeper Patrick Etheridge of the Cape Hatteras Lifesaving Station uttered the phrase to his crew before a particularly perilous rescue where the crew feared they would not make it back if they attempted. Clarence Brady, a crewman with Keeper Etheridge, recalls the skipper saying, "The Blue Book says we've got to go out. It doesn't say a damn thing about having to come back." Well, he wasn't wrong. According to the regulations of the Lifesaving Service of 1889, the Bible of life-saving stations at the time, Section 252, page 58 states, in attempting a rescue, the keeper will select either the boat, breeches buoy, or life car, as in his judgment is best suited to effectively cope with the existing conditions. If the device first selected fails after such trial as satisfies him that no further attempt with it is feasible, he will resort to one of the others, and if that fails, then to the remaining one, and he will not desist from his efforts until by actual trial the impossibility of effecting a rescue is demonstrated. The statement of the keeper that he did not try to use the boat because the sea or surf was too heavy will not be accepted unless attempts to launch it were actually made and failed, or unless the conformation of the coast, such as bluffs, precipitous banks, etc., is such as to unquestionable to preclude the use of a boat. This order carried on to the U.S. Coast Guard word for word, all the way up to the 1934 instructions to U.S. Coast Guard stations. It's worth noting the Humane Society still exists today, and I put the link to their website on the screen for you. Today, they still specialize in educating lifesavers, providing charitable funding to organizations such as Boston MedFlight, and they award lifesavers who have put their own lives at risk for the safety of strangers. I encourage you to take some time, view their webpage. There's a lot of good information there, some of which I use for tonight's lecture. On the Life Saving Awards page, you'll see a few references to some recent awards that they've given out. With that, let's take a look at the other half of the Cape Cod Coast Guard, the U.S. Lighthouse Service, excuse me. The first lighthouse built in America was located at Little Brewster Island in Boston. Lighthouses had already existed in a number of locations around the world, but with the newly established nation in America, the need for a lighthouse administration was immediately apparent. The Lighthouse Service can trace its roots all the way back to 1789. Fun fact, that's a year before most people consider the beginnings of the Coast Guard, but that's a whole other argument. In 1789, Congress formally assumed responsibility for harbors and their approaches. This act of Congress created the lighthouse establishment and took over jurisdiction of the 12 lighthouses in existence at the time in order to provide the necessary support, maintenance, and repairs of all lighthouses, beacons, buoys, and public piers erected before the passing of this act. Prior to the act, the lighthouses had been paid for, built, and administered by the colonies, individuals, and individual states, and in many cases, private citizens. In one such example, the Bass River Light, which is still around today, was nothing more than a lamp in an attic window. The worldwide history of lighthouses and life-saving has always been closely intertwined, and for good reason. Often, lighthouses were located at the most perilous locations for mariners. These locations were often remote and desolate, many times surrounded by treacherous seas and rocks. In these cases, if a ship happened to wander off course or become uncontrollable in a strong storm, they would find the rocks nearby a lighthouse. In these cases, a lighthouse keeper became the de facto lifesaver. Now, I'm sure it's no secret to this evening's attendees that the history of lighthouses on Cape Cod is quite extensive. As you can imagine, the 559 miles of coastline on the Cape is quite treacherous and was even more so in the 1800s. Now imagine limited aids to navigation, no electronic means of knowing your position, and a sparsely inhabited coast. Very dark, very black, very hard to figure out where you are. It's estimated that the Cape is the site of over 3,000 shipwrecks in its history. If one examines a chart of the coast and look at what the sea route would be from Boston to all points south, you quickly realize there's a big sandbar in the way, and you must basically feel your way around. So a series of lighthouses was established around the Cape from Provincetown all the way down to Monomoy on the islands and all the way over to New Bedford. Starting in 1797 and continuing to 1961, 27 of the lighthouses were constructed on the Cape. Typically, single lighthouses with different light characteristics would be established, but in the case of the Cape, several sites were established with different numbers of lights at each site, 1 at Race Point in Provincetown, 3 at Eastham, 2 at Chatham, thereby reducing possible confusion from one site to the next. Now, obviously, there's another dozen or so lighthouses around the Cape, but this group of lights were the most visible from the offshore shipping routes. Even today, the Nauset Light and Chatham Light are still visible simultaneously from nearly all points east, with very different characteristics so as to not be confused with one another. Due to the necessity of aids to navigation around the Cape, Massachusetts is home naturally to many firsts among lighthouses. The first manned lighthouse over open water in America was the Buzzards Bay Light, built in 1961. The Three Sisters lights are the only group of 3 lights in one location. Wood End Light was the first in Massachusetts to utilize solar power to charge its batteries and operate its fog signal. One of the first Fresnel lenses in existence was installed at Gay Head Light. It is believed that the first fog signal was placed at Boston Light, where a cannon was fired periodically to warn ships away. Now, interestingly to me, both the Lifesaving Service and the Lighthouse Service at this time used the same districting, even though they were under 2 different categories of the federal government. That is, on the map that I have on your screen now, you can see all of Massachusetts and some of Rhode Island and New Hampshire are located within what was then the 2nd Lighthouse District. Similarly, the 2nd Life-Saving District comprised the same area and contained 32 individual life-saving stations. Now, the Chatham site, you'll notice that it's not quite the same as it was back in 1841, but the current Chatham site was not originally a Coast Guard station. It was a lighthouse station. It was solely there for the purpose of manning the twin lights in 1808, and was the 2nd lighthouse station on the Cape, second to Highland Light and Truro, of course. Now, the two lights we know and love today were constructed in 1877, and the North Tower was moved to Eastham in 1923 to become what is now the Nauset Light. I don't want to get into the weeds with the lighthouse history any more than we already have, because there's so many volumes and lectures on just that subject alone. So I'll give you this shameless plug for the museum. The original top to Chatham Light was replaced in 1969. We removed the Fresnel lens for a more efficient and brighter rotating light, which is similar to what we have in today. That Fresnel lens and the original lighthouse cap are still on display at the Atwood Museum. The nationwide network of U.S. life-saving stations continued to operate in much the same way that Sumner Kimmel had envisioned up until 1915. In addition to the lighthouses, the Cape area found the deployment of light ships to be of great benefit to mariners. Light ships were used to mark dangerous areas where lighthouses were either impossible or impractical. For example, around Monomoy, there were several locations where a light ship would be anchored to warn off from Pollock Rift. Excuse me, words are hard. The light ships would be anchored to warn off from Pollock Rip and its dangerous current, or Bishop and Clerks, for example, off of Hyannis due to the dangerous shoaling. Life aboard these vessels was simultaneously known as the most hazardous profession in the maritime services, but also very monotonous and boring. My wife's grandfather served aboard the light ship Chesapeake up until its decommissioning and often told stories of card games. The Nantucket, as you may know, became famous for their basket weaving, as sailors with nothing to do would take to making these gifts for the women in their lives or to make some extra money while on shore. The other side of that coin, however, is that the light ships were quite susceptible to dangerous seas and lost ships as they spent their entire existence at anchor. On many occasions during storms, a light ship's anchor would drag, or worse, the chain itself would break apart. The crews would be left scrambling to start the engines and attempt to navigate the underpowered beasts back into position, or at least to relative safety. In one such instance, the light ship Nantucket was struck and broke in two after a collision with RMS Olympic in 1934. If that name sounds familiar, she's one of the sister ships to the Titanic. It was not uncommon for light ships to be rammed unintentionally, as ships trying to find their way in the fog would often steer toward the sound signal of the light ship and then, once in sight, attempt to turn away to proceed on their course. This was the case of the Olympic, but they did not see the Nantucket until they were a mere 500 feet away, traveling at a speed of 20 knots, which was incredibly fast for ships of that time. 7 of the 11 crewmen aboard the Nantucket perished, and the captain died a few months later from injuries he suffered in that collision. About a dozen of these light ships were stationed around the Cape and Islands, and their positions were periodically updated as the shoals and sands of the Cape shifted over the years. The Pollock Rip light ship was located in 4 different locations over her years of service, for example. So how did the Lifesaving Service and the Lighthouse Service become the Coast Guard we know today? And why is Station Chatham where it's at? Well, in 1915, the U.S. Coast Guard was created, which merged the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service and the U.S. Lifesaving Service and placed them under the command of the Department of Treasury. Eventually, in 1939, the Coast Guard absorbed the U.S. Lighthouse Service, which is where we made the Cape Cod Coast Guard we know today. Now, if you'll recall, there was a Chatham Lifesaving Service station in addition to the Chatham Light Station. They were in two different locations. What was then known as the Chatham Lifesaving Station was located on the north end of Monomoy, near the cut, that what was then called the cut through, within easy distance of Chatham Village, they said. And then in 1879 was described as being located 1 1/4 miles south of Chatham Light. As is the case today, the beaches along Chatham shifted quickly and frequently. As such, the boat station needed to move with the sands. However, in 1945, the lifeboat station on Monomoy was disestablished, and all Coast Guard operations from Eastham to the tip of Monomoy were consolidated to the former Chatham Light Station. The station was deemed Coast Guard Lifeboat Station number 42 and has been in continuous operation from that location since. Now, I want to give a little plug here for ourselves at the station. If you haven't been by the station recently, the sign that was over the door that was left behind by the movie company, it was due for replacing. It was starting to rot. When I asked Chatham Sign Company to make us a new sign, I specifically asked them to make something that was appropriate for the period, 1945-ish. And I asked them to add Lifeboat Station number 42 as a designator, because at the time, that was how the stations were designated within the early Coast Guard. So we're trying to carry some of that history through. The final site of the former Chatham Station location, as I understand it, and please, Caroline, correct me if I'm wrong, is where the Fish and Wildlife Visitor Center is now. And sadly, due to more beach erosion from the South Cut moving to where it is now, that boathouse and the equipment building had to be dismantled a few months ago. And so here we are in 2023, and my office at the station is within the original lightkeeper's quarters, as is a significant portion of the building. We've added berthing rooms to replace the old bunkhouses that used to exist behind the building, and we've tried to keep up with modern amenities such as running water, electricity, internet, phone service, while preserving the outward appearance of the building to the best of our ability. And even after all this time, my boats are still scattered all over town. The other lower and outer Cape stations were eventually closed to become consolidated to Station Chatham and Station Provincetown. The Mid-Cape and Upper Cape stations were consolidated to Station Woods Hole and Station Cape Cod Canal. But what about the air station? You may be familiar with the concept of the breeches buoy apparatus that I mentioned earlier. If you're not, I'd highly recommend taking a look into this very complex but absolutely brilliant method for rescuing survivors from a foundered ship. And this is a very good picture of it here, and it's a lot to try to go over. The U.S. Lifesaving Service Heritage Association, which is located right here in Cape Cod, they have an excellent website to learn more, and I'll put that on your screen here. They have all the information on how breeches buoy apparatus and such work. Personally, I took part in a reenactment team at Chickamauga, North Carolina, that pulled the beach cart out to the sand dunes, set up the entire apparatus, just as my predecessors did every Tuesday for drill and any time a ship was in need. It's a testament to the strength and the selflessness of those surfmen in the Lifesaving Service and early Coast Guard lifeboat stations. Now, when I tell people about this complex apparatus, the evolution, all of it, one of the questions I often get is, well, aren't you glad you have the boats now? Well, fact of the matter is, the breeches buoy didn't go away because of newer boats. The breeches buoy was replaced by the helicopter. Had it not been for the discovery of rotational lift, we'd likely still be employing the breeches buoy today. To that end, it brings us to the next chapter of the Coast Guard on Cape Cod. It could be said that the Coast Guard's introduction to aviation took place in 1903, when the Wright brothers made their fateful flights. This is actually pretty accurate. The only photograph we have of the event, the only one that you've ever seen of that first flight, was taken by a surfman from Lifeboat Station number 6 in North Carolina. The telegram that was sent to their father back in Dayton announcing the first human-powered flight was sent from that same station, which also served double duty as the Kitty Hawk Weather Bureau. Side note, if you happen to find yourself on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, that station's still there. It's a pretty good restaurant called the Black Pelican, and the telegraph machine that was used is kept behind glass at the hostess station. But I digress. Second Lieutenant Norman Hall and Third Lieutenant Elmer Stone, with the support of their commanding officer, Captain Chiswell, approached the Curtis Flying School in Newport News, Virginia, to discuss the concept of using aircraft for the purpose of life saving. Long story short, Elmer Stone would later become the first Coast Guard aviator in 1916, only a year after the Coast Guard was established. Just 9 years later, in 1925, the Coast Guard established the first aviation station to serve Massachusetts in Gloucester, dubbed Coast Guard Aviation Station 10 Pound Island. Now, that's a mouthful. It was on the grounds of what is today Coast Guard Station Gloucester. The station was primarily used for seaplanes patrolling for rum runners during Prohibition, but in its first 4 years of operation, aircraft from 10 Pound Island rendered assistance to distressed mariners at least 212 times. As aviation technology advanced and aircraft became larger and more capable, 10 Pound Island was disestablished, and Coast Guard Air Station Salem was established in 1935. The air station was built on Winter Island, whose military history dates all the way back to 1799. That unit was responsible for operations from New York City to the Canadian border, and in its first year performed 26 medevac missions. Air Station Salem conducted anti-submarine patrols over the course of World War II, and in October of 1944 became the first air station on the East Coast to be designated as part of the Air Rescue Service. Air Station Salem, however, was built around the concept of flying boats, what we refer to today as seaplanes, and by 1950, it became apparent that flying boats were not the only answer to maritime aviation. With the invention of the helicopter and the benefit of standard airplanes becoming capable of faster, longer flights, the Coast Guard needed an air station that would allow for traditional land-based operations. You can see by the picture here of Air Station Salem that there was no room for a runway. In 1970, Air Station Cape Cod replaced Air Station Salem and still operates today out of Joint Base. Over the years, as technological advances improved communications, safety, and navigation, the network of 32 lifeboat stations, 27 lighthouses, and 12 lightships were slowly consolidated down to the organization of Sector Southeastern New England that we know today. Better positioning sources, brighter lights in the lighthouses, faster and more capable boats, even the availability of weather information to the mariners have all helped to reduce the need for so many stations along the coast. Today, the Coast Guard operates 10 boat stations and 1 air station in Massachusetts. All but 4 of these stations are located within Cape Cod and the islands. From humble beginnings in a dark tavern in Boston, the Lifesaving Service became part of a service that today employs over 40,000 active duty military personnel, 7,700 reservists, 30,000 volunteer auxiliaries, and 8,500 civilians manning a fleet of over 250 ships, 2,000 small boats, 200 aircraft across all 50 states, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Persian Gulf. The Coast Guard as a whole is the world's 12th largest naval force. Our 11 statutory missions today include search and rescue, law enforcement, port and waterway security, drug interdiction, aids to navigation, living marine resources enforcement, defense readiness, ICE operations, marine environmental protection, and migrant interdiction. It's a huge mission that can only be accomplished by highly dedicated and motivated personnel who are committed to the same core mission that founded the Lifesaving Service. Always ready to ensure the safety of life at sea and the security of our maritime domain. It's amazing what one can accomplish when you have a few like-minded people. A good pint of beer. If you haven't visited the museum in a while, please do. They have an absolute treasure trove of maritime history, and the staff is 100% dedicated to preserving and telling the story of the Cape. And Caroline already mentioned some new exhibits that they have coming up, which I'm personally very excited about. Lastly, if you feel inclined to donate to the cause of the Chatham Historical Society, you can make a tax-deductible donation through their website here on the screen. And with that, I'll stand by for a few questions. I think there's one up there already. I can't pretend to be an expert in the field, only a very novice enthusiast. Of course, questions about Coast Guard in general are welcome. And if you know anybody who may be interested in joining the Coast Guard, either in an active duty capacity or reservists or auxiliaries, please let me know. I can point you in the right direction and get you to the right people to get you started. And with that, thank you very much. And Caroline, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Ross. That was a lot of really great history. We're already getting some really nice comments back about your lecture. We're going to start. We have a question from Elizabeth, who says there's a lot of naming of the early services under the Department of Revenue. Was this department something to do with these services?
Yes. So the Coast Guard in general at the time goes all the way back to 1790. Alexander Hamilton, who we refer to as the father of the service. Let me back up a second. The U.S. Navy, right after the Revolution was won, the Department of the Navy was disbanded. So there was no naval force that was protecting our shores. And we were having some issues in our nation's history about tariffs for imports and visiting ships from other nations. So Alexander felt that a few small ships judiciously placed along the coast could serve to help protect the nation and collect these tariffs. So that's where the Revenue Cutter Service was born, and it was under the Department of Treasury. So Alexander Hamilton was the first treasurer of the United States. It just so happens that when the Humane Society, which then turned into the U.S. Lifesaving Service, when they were formally federally funded, that's a mouthful, when they became federally funded, they were also put under the Department of Treasury and administered by the Revenue Service. So over the course of the years, we stuck with the Revenue Service until sometime in the 60s, if I remember correctly, when we were absorbed to the Department of Transportation, where we stayed until 2002, when we became under the Department of Homeland Security, like we are today.
All right, great. Definitely answered that one. Okay, and then I have a question saying, do you have any recommended reading on some of your mentioned rescues, in particular about Joshua James?
Okay, so for Joshua James, a simple Google search will actually take you to some tremendous resources. Let me grab a book real quick and I will show you one of the books that I utilized for my research for tonight is The U.S. Lifesaving Service, Heroes, Rescues, and Architecture of the Early Coast Guard. This was written by Ralph Shanks, Wick York, and Lisa Wu Shanks. They did some absolutely great research on this. Caroline, if there's a way that I can put that up on the screen so people can write that down, because I think this is a tremendous resource of everything about the Lifesaving Service, and all the information about Joshua James is in here, and it had a lot of detail about those 2 years. So yes, the U.S. Lifesaving Service, Heroes, Rescues, and Architecture of the Early Coast Guard.
Okay, great. We can type that into the chat for people to copy.
Okay.
So we'll do that.
Let me put it, yeah, I'll put it into
Marks
there.
Great. And I'll pull up the next question.
Okay. Oh.
All righty.
Got it to you.
Great. So that's in the chat, and we'll put that up for everyone. Now, our next question is there a National Coast Guard Museum in the United States?
They are actually just now beginning to break ground on it in New London, Connecticut. It's a project that's been in progress for about 15 to 20 years, and they're starting to build it now. I'm really excited about it because I actually have some stuff at the station that I have stumbled across that I think is going to be very nice to put into the museum there. It's going to be a few years, but keep your eyes peeled for that one. It's coming soon, and based on the plans that I've seen, it's going to be really exciting.
Very cool. All right, so now we have, what was your rank while on the Nimitz duty?
I served as an aviation electronics technician. I arrived as an airman apprentice and left as a third-class petty officer, but sadly, I was in Newport News shipyard the entire time. So all I did was hang doors, which is why I didn't stick around in the Navy for very long.
All right, that's great. I think I know there's a couple of Navy veterans listening to this lecture tonight. So let's see. We have someone asking, do you play the trombone and the guitar?
The trombone was my primary instrument when I was younger. I have some awards that are outside of the screen, including the Sousa Award. I had a full ride scholarship offered at the University of Arkansas for music and turned it down so that I could go join the Navy. And the guitar, sadly, is one of those that I got and kind of pluck at it here and there. But to play it, I wouldn't say I play it. I kind of pluck at it. I have a saxophone back there as well, which was my secondary. So now it's my kids' turn to start getting into that stuff.
That's great. Okay, let's see. We have someone asking about your awards. Can you explain some of the awards that you have from your bio at the beginning? We have,
Sure.
Just as a refresher, we have the Coast Guard Commendation Medal, Coast Guard Commendation Team Commendation, and so on.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do it, try to remember them from memory because it's 23 years of service that I'm having to recall. But most notably for tonight's presentation, 2 of my 3 Team Commendation Awards came from participating in the Breaches Buoy reenactment team at Chickamauga. That was a fantastic opportunity that was presented to me. The surfman who was at Cape Hatteras at the time thought it would be a good idea, and it was fantastic. I learned so much about our history there. My Coast Guard Commendation Medal was awarded to me most recently after I left as the Executive Petty Officer of Coast Guard Station Portsmouth, namely because being the Executive Petty Officer there, I had to handle a lot of logistics and a lot of personnel issues that were strained because of the COVID pandemic. I reported there in 2020, so we were still in the height of it. Then right before that, I received the Coast Guard Achievement Medal for service performed at Coast Guard Station Chincoteague. I was asked to go take command there temporarily due to a relief for cause. So I had to go in there and take over and kind of clean things up and get that station back on the right track.
Great. Next question is, will there be tours at the Chatham Lighthouse this summer?
Yes, the Coast Guard Auxiliary is going to be doing tours again. The Coast Guard Auxiliary website that they have for Flotilla 11-1, which is our local flotilla here, they have the dates that they're planning on doing it. Basically, it's every Wednesday. We start with the Chatham History Weekend. We give tours both of those days, and then every Wednesday thereafter, so long as the weather allows. Now, I still can't allow people inside the lighthouse at this point because of the old lead paint. Namely, it's flaking off of a cabinet that's just below the light platform. And until I can get that cleaned out, there's no way that I can allow the public inside, but we're working on it. This may not sound like much, but Chatham Lighthouse is a number 4 priority in the entire District 1, which is a very high probability that I'm going to get funding for de-leading it and getting a new coat of paint on it here very soon, hopefully this year. I'm rattling the sabers with everybody that I can to try to get the Chatham Lighthouse refinished because I think the town deserves it and the lighthouse really needs it. And I have the support of the actual owner of the lighthouse, which is the Aton unit at Woods Hole. He's very passionate about Coast Guard history, and he's helping me try to get the funding to get that done. But we will be bringing people on the grounds. I'm hoping to be able to get people inside the station as well, so you can see our little museum that we have there, and we have the opportunity to talk to you about modern day Coast Guard operations. And I'm really hoping, and this is something I haven't told anybody yet, so this is exclusive to the folks who joined in today. I'm trying to get an open house put together. A Saturday in the summertime where we can do something similar to what the airport did, have a whole bunch of people come out, welcome you to the Coast Guard Station, and basically talk to you about, what we do on the daily. So we're really looking forward to some exciting things coming up here this year.
That's great. I know a lot of folks who will be very excited about that. And I would recommend, even if you can't get up into the lighthouse this summer, guys, still take the tour. It's a really good one. It's totally worth the time. Right now, we've got a few comments, not so much questions. We have from Dawn, a superb presentation, great job, and kudos to you. United States Navy retired. We have Doreen saying, "Hi, Chief. This is Dory Riley."
I know Dory.
She's
Dory is a
great job.
wonderful person. She's our auxiliary lighthouse keeper, and we're trying to help her out as best we can. But she's down there thawing out in Florida while we're up here freezing.
That's great. And then we have one other question, which says, "Do you yet know your next duty station?"
Possibly retirement. I don't know. I've only been here since May. And my tour length here is supposed to be 4 years. So I won't be shopping for that job for another couple of years at least, unless something comes along where the Coast Guard needs me somewhere else, which my history with the service, the last 5 years, I've moved 4 times. So I'm hoping to stay on Cape Cod for a little bit and actually be able to settle down for some time.
That'd be good. All right. Well, let's see. We'll have one more question and we'll wrap things up. What are your favorite stations down the East Coast?
Oh, well, of course, Chatham.
Good answer.
Chatham is a location that I never thought that I would be stationed for a multitude of reasons. So when it came up as an availability to me on my pick list, it was put pretty high on my pick. So I'm really happy that I'm here, and it's been absolutely fantastic. My favorite units going down the East Coast, Chatham, Virginia, I thought was great. I wouldn't recommend it to a lot of people. It's a pretty desolate unit, but I loved my time there. And then Oregon Inlet, North Carolina was absolutely tremendous. There's so much history there, and it's such a unique unit. Hatteras Inlet, directly south of that, was a fantastic unit as well. I'm a Southeast kind of guy, so I like being on the Gulf Coast. But if we're talking just the East Coast, those 4 stations are absolutely my favorite.
Fantastic. Well, Ross, I think I speak for everyone when we say thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for serving Chatham. We really appreciate it. It's been spoken about around how much community outreach you've been doing, and it's definitely noted and appreciated by everyone here in town. So once again, thank you so much. We're getting lots of comments saying great job. Thank you. Thank you for joining everything. So once again, thank you so much. And we appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And the wheels of the federal government move slowly, but I'm trying to do what I can because the town deserves it. And I have a passion for this station, and I want to make sure that she is putting on the show for our visitors that you all deserve. So thank you very much for the support and the kind words. And thank you, Caroline, for inviting me to be here this evening. It's been a good time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining. We look forward to hopefully see you at our next lecture in March. Till then, have a good evening.